The house felt louder when nothing was happening. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. The kitchen was still dark when Margaret sat down at the small oak table she'd owned for over 30 years. The same table where homework papers once spread like wings. The same surface that had held birthday cakes, folded hands, uncomfortable conversations, and quiet cups of coffee after long days. Now, in the pale, early light of an Ohio morning, it held only a ceramic mug and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Margaret wrapped both hands around the mug, not because the coffee was especially hot, but because the warmth felt grounding. At 68, she'd learned that mornings had a tone, almost a personality. Some arrived gently, others felt heavy before the day even began. This one was somewhere in between. She wasn't sick. Nothing dramatic. No alarms going off. Just a familiar awareness that had been growing over the past few years. The sense that her body no longer reset overnight the way it once did. Sleep didn't always restore her. Meals didn't always energize her. And sometimes, sitting quietly like this, she wondered when she'd started noticing these things at all. Outside, a neighbor's garage door lifted and closed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then stopped. Life was moving, as it always did. Margaret took a sip of coffee and stared at the small bowl on the table. Oatmeal, prepared the same way she'd been making it lately. Simple. Almost boring. She smiled faintly at that thought. There was a time when she chased excitement in food. Weekend brunches with heavy plates. Late-night takeout after long workdays. Rich sauces, oversized portions, meals that felt like rewards. Back then, her body absorbed it all without complaint, like a sponge that never filled up. But years have a way of changing the rules quietly, without asking permission. What struck her most wasn't discomfort. It was subtlety. The way her energy dipped earlier in the afternoon. The way heavy meals lingered longer than they used to. The way her body seemed to ask politely but persistently for a little more care. Margaret wasn't alone in this, of course. Many people she knew spoke in the same careful language. Not fear, not diagnosis, just observations. I don't bounce back like I used to. I can't eat that late anymore. I feel better when I keep things light. These weren't medical statements. They were lived experiences, shared over phone calls and kitchen counters across the country. She thought about her sister, in Arizona, who had recently started cooking more soups. About a friend from church who swapped heavy dinners for earlier, simpler meals. About the way these changes weren't announced with fanfare, but adopted quietly, like turning the volume down instead of switching the music off. Margaret spooned up the oatmeal slowly. The taste was mild, comforting. It didn't demand attention. It didn't overwhelm. And oddly enough, that felt right. As she ate, her mind wandered not to worries, but to curiosity. When had food become less about indulgence and more about how she wanted to feel afterward? When had the question shifted from, what sounds good, to, what will support me through the rest of the day? She remembered her father, years before he passed, eating the same breakfast almost every morning. Toast, fruit, coffee. At the time, it seemed unimaginative. Now, it felt wise, not rigid, just consistent. There's a strange clarity that sometimes arrives with age, not the kind that gives answers, but the kind that sharpens questions. Margaret didn't want miracles. She didn't want promises. She simply wanted to understand how small daily choices, repeated gently over time, could shape how she felt in her own body. The idea that health isn't something you chase, but something you tend to, like a garden you walk through every day, noticing which plants thrive and which need less water, had been settling into her thoughts lately. Not as science, as perspective. She rinsed the bowl in the sink and watched the water carry away the last traces of breakfast. Outside, the sky had brightened. Morning had officially arrived. Margaret grabbed her cardigan from the back of the chair and paused for a moment before heading into the living room. There was no rush. Retirement had softened her relationship with time. What mattered now was how the day felt as it unfolded. She didn't know yet that this quiet attention, this simple noticing of meals, energy, and rhythm would lead her to rethink what the best meal really meant. Not the trendiest, not the most talked about, but the one that respected her body where it was now. And maybe that was the beginning of something. Not a transformation you could measure overnight, but a shift in awareness. And a maintenance, he's a matter and sad, wherefore or answer for, wherefore and side and tenure. Wherefore, unizuf, wherefore, wherefore, ensifend, wherefore, wherefore, the kind that starts at a kitchen table, in silence, with a warm mug and an ordinary bowl of food. If you'd like to explore more chapters, stay with the series. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? The coffee smelled right, but the spark never quite arrived. Margaret noticed it halfway through her second cup. The ritual was the same as it had always been. Coffee grounds measured by feel, not spoon. The familiar gurgle of the machine, steam, curling up into the quiet kitchen like a promise. For decades, that first mug had been her on switch. It told her body, we're awake now, let's go. But lately, the message seemed to get lost. She sat by the window, watching a pair of cardinals hop along the fence, and waited for that familiar lift. The gentle buzz, the sense that her thoughts were lining up, ready to move. Instead, what came was something softer, slower, not exhaustion, just a delay, as if her energy had decided to take the scenic route. Margaret didn't panic. She didn't label it as a problem. She simply noticed it the way you notice a song playing a half step lower than you remember. Subtle, but unmistakable. Later that morning, she met her friend Linda for a walk around the neighborhood. They'd been doing this every Tuesday for years, pacing each other past trimmed lawns and mailboxes decorated with seasonal flags. As they walked, Linda laughed and shook her head. I swear, she said, coffee used to feel like flipping a switch. Now it's more like warming up an old lamp. Margaret smiled, relieved to hear the thought spoken out loud. It wasn't just her. They talked about nothing serious. Grandkids, a new grocery store opening nearby, the way the weather couldn't make up its mind anymore. But beneath the small talk was a shared understanding that their bodies were changing in ways that didn't announce themselves loudly. No warnings, no dramatic moments. Just quiet shifts. What many people notice around this stage of life isn't a lack of effort. It's that the same inputs don't always produce the same outputs. You eat the same breakfast, drink the same coffee, sleep roughly the same number of hours, and yet the day unfolds differently. Margaret thought of it like starting an older car on a cold morning. The engine still works, it just needs a moment, a little patience, maybe a gentler approach. Over lunch that day, a simple sandwich. Eaten slowly, she paid closer attention than usual. Not in a critical way. Just curious. How heavy did she feel afterward? How long before she wanted to move again? These weren't scientific measurements. They were personal reflections, the kind that come from living in a body for nearly 7 decades. What she noticed surprised her. The days she kept things lighter earlier on, her energy seemed steadier. Not higher. Steadier. Fewer peaks and dips. Less of that mid-afternoon fog that used to send her searching for another cup of coffee she didn't really want. Many studies talk about how, over time, digestion and circulation become a little less efficient. Margaret didn't know the details, and she didn't feel the need to. What made sense to her was the metaphor Linda once used. It's like your body gets better at asking for quality instead of quantity. Way 27. Food in that sense wasn't fuel you dumped in all at once. It was more like kindling. A little at a time, chosen with care. That afternoon, Margaret skipped her usual cookie with tea. Not as a rule. Just as an experiment. Instead, she sliced up an apple and sat on the back porch, listening to the breeze move through the trees. The sweetness was enough. More than enough. She thought about how often energy is framed as something you force through caffeine, sugar, pushing harder. But what if, at this stage of life, energy was something you protected instead? That idea stayed with her into the evening. Dinner was earlier than usual, nothing fancy. A bowl of soup she'd made over the weekend, reheated gently on the stove. She ate without distractions, noticing how her body responded. When she stood up afterward, there was no heaviness pulling her back toward the chair, just ease. None of this felt like a breakthrough. There were no fireworks, just a quiet alignment between what she ate and how she felt afterward. And that, Margaret realized, was enough to pay attention to. Before bed, she wrote a few lines in a small notebook she kept on her nightstand. Not a food journal, just observations. Lighter lunch, steadier afternoon, earlier dinner felt good. She closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. There's a kind of wisdom that comes from listening without trying to control the outcome. From letting patterns reveal themselves instead of demanding answers. Margaret was beginning to understand that her body wasn't failing her. It was communicating more softly now, perhaps, but honestly. The next morning, she'd still have coffee. She enjoyed it too much to give it up. But she'd stopped expecting it to do all the work. Energy, she was learning, came from the whole picture, from rhythm, from respect, from meals that didn't ask her body to fight uphill all day. As she drifted towards sleep, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a while, not excitement, but reassurance. The sense that she didn't need to overhaul her life to feel better. She just needed to notice what was already working, and do a little more of that. It was just a sentence on the radio, almost missed. Margaret had the station on low while rinsing dishes. The kind of background noise meant more for company than information. The host was wrapping up a segment, voice calm, conversational, when he mentioned a comment Elon Musk had made in a recent interview. Something about keeping meals simple on long workdays, about food being fuel rather than a focal point. Then the segment moved on. Margaret dried her hands and stood there for a moment, longer than necessary, the dish towel folded neatly over the sink. It wasn't the name that caught her attention. Public figures came and went, opinions piled on opinions. What lingered was the idea itself, not as advice, not as instruction, just as a glimpse into how someone else thought about eating. Simple, efficient, uncomplicated. She went back to her day and forgot about it. Or at least, she thought she did. Later that afternoon, while driving to the grocery store, the thought surfaced again. Not Elon Musk, exactly, but the way the comment had landed so lightly. No promises, no drama, just an observation shared in passing. It reminded her of how wisdom often shows up quietly, without insisting on being noticed. At the store, Margaret moved slowly through the aisles, reading labels less out of discipline and more out of curiosity. She noticed how much effort went into selling excitement. Bold claims, bright packaging, words like ultimate and power. It all felt very loud. She found herself reaching instead for familiar foods. Things she recognized. Ingredients she didn't have to decode. There was comfort in that, but also clarity. On the drive home, she reflected on how often conversations about food turn extreme. Superfoods, forbidden foods, miracle meals. Yet, the comment she'd half heard on the radio hadn't pointed in any of those directions. It hadn't suggested doing more, just doing less, more intentionally. That evening, she mentioned it to Linda on the phone. "I heard this thing earlier," Margaret said, choosing her words carefully. "About keeping meals simple. Not for health reasons exactly. Just focus." Linda chuckled. "Funny you say that. My grandson's always talking about optimizing everything. But the older I get, the more I think simplicity is the real optimization." Margaret smiled at that. It felt true in a way that didn't need defending. This wasn't about copying someone else's habits. It wasn't about following a billionaire's routine or chasing some secret edge. It was about noticing a shared thread that when life gets full, complexity loses its charm. Many people observe that as responsibilities grow and bodies change, there's less tolerance for excess. Heavy meals, overstimulating routines, too much of anything. What once felt indulgent can start to feel draining. Margaret thought about her own life. The years when multitasking was a badge of honor, when eating quickly meant you were busy, important, needed. Now, with fewer demands pulling at her attention, she was discovering the relief of narrowing the focus. Dinner that night was quiet. She ate at the table, no television, no phone. Just food, warmth, and time. The meal itself wasn't remarkable. What stood out was how it fit into the evening, instead of taking it over. Afterward, she felt clear-headed, present, as if her body appreciated not having to negotiate with what she'd just given it. There's a cultural idea that the best things must be hidden, complicated, or exclusive. But sometimes, the best ideas are the ones you almost ignore because they sound too ordinary. Margaret rinsed her plate and placed it carefully in the rack. She thought again of that half-heard sentence on the radio and smiled at how it had circled back into her day, not as a directive, but as a gentle nudge. Simplicity, she was realizing, isn't about deprivation. It's about alignment, about choosing what supports you, without asking for applause. The road looked clear, but traffic moved slower than it used to. Margaret noticed it on her drive into town, hands steady on the wheel as she followed the same route she'd driven for years. The lanes were familiar, the signs hadn't changed. Yet, lately, even on calm mornings, everything seemed to flow just a little more slowly. No honking, no chaos, just a gradual easing of pace. It reminded her of something she'd been thinking about, how the body changes with time. Not in sharp turns, but in gentle curves. At home later that morning, she stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables for soup. The rhythm of the knife was soothing. As she worked, her thoughts wandered to a conversation she'd had with her doctor months earlier. Nothing alarming. Just a routine visit. A reminder that, as we age, the body doesn't process things quite as efficiently as it once did. Not worse, just differently. Many studies describe circulation like a network of roads, carrying nutrients and oxygen the way highways carry traffic. When we're young, those roads are wide and flexible, built to handle rush hour without much trouble. Over time, wear and tear adds up. Lanes narrow slightly, curves stiffen, traffic still moves, it just requires more patience. Margaret liked that metaphor. It didn't feel frightening. It felt honest. She thought about how often health conversations jump straight to charts and numbers, forgetting that most people experience change as sensation, not data. The heaviness after a meal, the way fingers feel colder in winter, the longer warm-up before a walk feels comfortable. These aren't failures. They're signals. As the soup simmered, she stirred slowly, watching the ingredients move together in the pot. Too much heat, and things stuck. Too little, and nothing happened. The balance mattered. That, she realized, was how meals interacted with the body now. Heavy, processed foods were like sending oversized trucks down aging roads. They still got through, but not without strain. Simpler, gentler foods moved more easily, asking less of the system that carried them. This wasn't medical instruction. It was a way of understanding what she felt in her own body, a personal reflection shaped by years of living, eating, and noticing. Later that afternoon, Margaret met her neighbor, Tom, while checking the mail. He leaned against his truck, stretching his back. "Used to eat anything," he said with a laugh. "Now my body lets me know when I've pushed it." Margaret nodded. "Mine too." It's not angry, just honest. They stood there for a moment, two people comparing notes on aging without complaint. There was comfort in that, in knowing these experiences were shared. Back inside, Margaret poured herself a glass of water and sat by the window. She thought about how often people frame health as a battle, something you fight or fix. But what if it was more like maintenance, regular care, attention, respect for the limits that come with time? Cars don't fail because they're driven. They fail when they're ignored, when oil changes are skipped, when small issues are left unaddressed. The body, she suspected, worked much the same way. Dinner that evening was light. A bowl of soup, a slice of bread. She ate slowly, noticing how it felt to finish without that familiar heaviness, pressing down on her chest or pulling her toward the couch. There was ease in it, relief. Margaret carried her bowl to the sink and paused, hand resting on the counter. She felt grateful not for perfect health, but for clarity, for the understanding that aging wasn't a sudden breakdown, but a series of small adjustments asking to be made. The roads were still open. Traffic was still moving. All it required was a little awareness of what she sent through. The plate looked almost disappointing at first glance. Margaret set it down on the table and studied it for a moment. No bright sauces, no dramatic presentation, just a modest portion of grilled fish, a scoop of lentils, and a small pile of greens dressed lightly with olive oil. The kind of meal no one posted online. The kind you might overlook entirely. She sat, folded her napkin, and wondered when her idea of a good meal had shifted so much. Years ago, food felt like an event. The bigger the plate, the more successful the outing. Restaurants meant indulgence. Cooking at home meant effort, often rewarded with rich flavors and full stomachs. Satisfaction was measured by how much was on the table. Now, as she lifted her fork, she noticed something different, not excitement, but calm. The fish flaked easily. The lentils were warm and earthy. The greens tasted clean, almost refreshing. Nothing competed for attention. Everything worked together quietly. As she ate, Margaret thought about a lunch she'd had the week before with an old coworker. They'd met at a diner they used to love, ordering the same dishes they always had. Halfway through, they both slowed down. "Guess my eyes are still hungry," her friend had said, pushing the plate away. "But my body's done." That line had stayed with Margaret. What many people begin to notice with age is that appetite and need aren't always aligned. Habits linger longer than physiology. You can crave what you used to handle easily, even when it no longer serves you the same way. Margaret finished her meal and waited. This was the part she paid attention to, now the after. How did her body respond once the eating stopped? There was no tightness, no urge to loosen her waistband, no heaviness settling in her chest, just a quiet sense of being fed, not filled. She leaned back in her chair and smiled to herself. It struck her then how often the most supportive choices feel underwhelming in the moment. They don't dazzle, they don't demand praise. They simply do their job and step aside. Later that evening, she called her daughter, Emily. They talked about work, about the kids, about nothing in particular. At one point, Emily mentioned trying a new restaurant. The portions were huge, she said. I felt kind of sluggish afterward. Margaret hesitated, then shared her own small observation. I've been eating simpler lately. It's not exciting, but I feel better afterward. Emily laughed softly. Maybe that's the trade-off as we get older. Less drama, more comfort. And Uzo, where, and. After the call, Margaret washed the dishes and wiped the counter clean. She thought about how culture often equates value with intensity, intense flavors, intense experiences, intense results. But bodies, especially aging ones, often respond best to moderation. Many studies suggest that over time, the way the body handles fats, sugars, and large portions changes. Margaret didn't dwell on the specifics. She didn't need to. Her own experience was enough to guide her. She poured a cup of tea and sat in her favorite chair, noticing how light she felt. Not energized in a jittery way. Just steady, present, comfortable in her own skin. There's a quiet confidence that comes from choosing what supports you, even when it doesn't impress anyone else. Margaret felt that confidence growing not as pride, but as trust in her own judgment. The meal had been ordinary. And yet, in its ordinariness, it had offered something she valued more than novelty: ease. As the evening settled in, she realized that the best meals might not announce themselves at all. They might simply leave you feeling at peace when everything else goes quiet. The chair felt closer after dinner than it used to. Margaret noticed it as she pushed her plate away and glanced toward the living room. The couch seemed to call her name, not with comfort, but with gravity. Years ago, dinner didn't end the day, it fueled the evening. Now, certain meals felt like punctuation marks, firm ones. She remembered family gatherings from a decade earlier. Late dinners, loud laughter, plates refilled without hesitation. The night would stretch on, energy spilling into stories and plans. These days, heavy meals had a different effect. They didn't invite conversation, they closed the door on it. That shift had crept in quietly, without ceremony. One evening not long ago, she and a few friends had gone out to eat. Nothing extravagant, just a popular local spot. By the time dessert menus arrived, the table had gone quiet. Everyone smiled politely, but shoulders sagged, eyes dulled. "Is it just me?" someone finally said. "Or does eating late hit harder now?" The laughter that followed was soft and knowing. Margaret thought about that as she stood at the sink, rinsing her plate. It wasn't that the food was bad. It was that her body processed it differently now. like a kitchen, with fewer burners, running at once, still capable, just more selective. Many people notice that metabolism changes with age, not dramatically, but steadily. The body becomes less forgiving of overload. Large, rich meals late in the day ask for work when the system is already winding down. Margaret pictured her digestion like a dinner rush in a small-town restaurant. Earlier in the day, the staff is fresh. Orders move smoothly. Later on, with fewer hands and less energy, things slow, pile on too much, and the whole place strains. That image made her chuckle. Tonight, she'd chosen something lighter, a small portion, earlier than usual, and as she wiped the counter, she realized she didn't feel pulled toward the couch. She felt open, free to move, free to sit without sinking. She took a short walk around the block, the air cool against her face. Streetlights flickered on, one by one. Her steps felt easy, not fast, comfortable. Back home, she made tea and sat by the window, reflecting on how often dinner is treated as the main event of the day. The biggest meal, the richest, the one you earn after hours of work. But what if, she wondered, dinner was meant to be more like a landing than a launch? A gentle close, not a grand finale. This wasn't about restriction, it was about timing, about recognizing that the body, like the rest of life, has rhythms. Morning is for building, evening is for settling. Margaret thought of something her mother used to say, "Eat like you care about tomorrow." At the time, it sounded like advice. Now, it felt like wisdom. As she prepared for bed, she noticed how easily sleep came. No heaviness pressing against her chest, no restlessness, just a smooth transition from day to night. There's a certain relief in adjusting expectations, in letting go of the idea that every meal has to be memorable. Sometimes, the most supportive choice is the one that lets the rest of your evening belong to you. Margaret turned off the light and slipped under the covers, feeling calm. She wasn't giving anything up. She was making room for comfort, for rest, for mornings that arrived without resistance. He talked about it the way someone mentions weather. Margaret was folding laundry when the clip came on her tablet, a short interview snippet someone had shared. Elon Musk was answering a question about long workdays, and somewhere between comments about focus and time management, he mentioned keeping meals simple. Nothing elaborate, nothing ceremonial, just enough to keep moving. No emphasis, no prescription. The moment passed almost immediately. Margaret set down a folded towel and replayed the clip once more, not because she was looking for guidance, but because of the tone. There was no pride in it, no sense of discovery, just a matter-of-fact observation about routine. It made her think about how often we overestimate the role of special strategies and underestimate the power of consistency. Later that day, she met her son, Daniel, for lunch. He'd suggested a new cafe downtown, full of exposed brick and clever menu descriptions. When the food arrived, it looked impressive. Tall stacks, bold flavors, plates designed to be photographed. Halfway through, Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Tastes great," he said, "but I feel like I need a nap already." Margaret laughed. "It's a lot." They talked about work, about how busy life felt, even when nothing urgent was happening. Daniel mentioned feeling scattered lately, pulled in too many directions. "Sometimes," Margaret said gently, "I think clarity comes from doing fewer things better. Not just at work. Everywhere." She didn't mention the interview. She didn't need to. The idea stood on its own. What many people notice about high performers, whether they're entrepreneurs, artists, or just steady, reliable folks, is that they tend to remove friction where they can. Decision fatigue is real. Every unnecessary choice takes a little energy. Simple meals reduce decisions. They free up mental space, not as a health tactic, but as a life one. Margaret experienced this firsthand at home. On days when she knew exactly what she was going to eat, there was a sense of ease that followed her through the afternoon. Less negotiating with herself, less second-guessing. That evening, she prepared the same meal she'd had earlier in the week. Familiar, predictable, comfortable. As she ate, she realized something that surprised her. She enjoyed it more this time, not less. Familiarity had softened it, Let her relax into the experience instead of evaluating it. There's a cultural myth that success comes from constantly upgrading, optimizing, reinventing. But maybe endurance, physical and mental, comes from narrowing the field. Margaret rinsed her plate and thought about how often people look for secrets in other people's lives, as if there's a hidden ingredient or routine that changes everything. But most of what sustains a person over decades isn't secret at all. It's repetitive, almost dull, and that's where its strength lies. Before bed, Margaret wrote in her notebook again. Simple meals. Fewer decisions. More calm. She closed it and placed it back on the nightstand. She wasn't trying to live like anyone else. She wasn't modeling her life after a billionaire or chasing efficiency for its own sake. She was simply noticing a pattern that when food stopped demanding attention, the rest of life felt easier to hold. Sometimes, the most useful ideas don't arrive as advice. They arrive as permission. Permission to keep things uncomplicated. Permission to trust that less can be enough. Haji, his manses. The engine still ran. It just needed a gentler touch. Margaret thought about that as she turned the key in her car one cool morning. The sound was familiar but slightly slower than it used to be, like an old friend clearing its throat before speaking. She waited an extra moment before pulling out of the driveway, letting everything warm up. Years ago, she wouldn't have noticed. Or maybe she would have, but brushed it off. Now, she paid attention to these small pauses, these quiet requests for patience. Later, while dusting the living room shelves, her thoughts returned to the idea of engines, not cars, but bodies. How they carry us for decades, adapting to every stage of life. How wear doesn't mean failure. It means history. Many studies describe inflammation and buildup in the body using technical language, but Margaret preferred simpler images. To her, it felt like residue that accumulates when systems are pushed too hard for too long. Not because they're weak, but because time leaves traces. She imagined her body as an engine that had been well used. Road trips, daily commutes, long stretches without rest. It had performed beautifully. Now, it asked for cleaner fuel, regular maintenance, and a bit more respect. That afternoon, she met Linda again for their walk. As they passed a row of parked cars, one hood open, Linda gestured toward it. Looks like he ignored the warning light, she said. Margaret smiled. We get those too. We just call them not feeling quite right. They walked on, the sidewalk crunching softly under their shoes. Neither of them spoke for a while, and that was fine. What Margaret had come to understand was that the body rarely breaks down all at once. It accumulates meals, habits, stress, years. The results show up gradually, often in ways that are easy to dismiss. A heavy lunch here, a sluggish afternoon there, sleep that doesn't quite restore. None of it dramatic enough to demand action, just enough to invite reflection. Back home, Margaret prepared dinner with that engine metaphor in mind. She chose foods that felt clean and straightforward. Nothing greasy, nothing that lingered in the air long after the meal was done. As she cooked, the kitchen smelled warm, not heavy. She ate slowly, noticing how her body received the meal. It felt like pouring the right oil into an old engine. Everything moved more smoothly afterward. No strain. No resistance. This wasn't about avoiding enjoyment, it was about understanding capacity. An engine designed for long journeys doesn't benefit from reckless driving. It benefits from steady hands and good fuel. Margaret washed her dishes and stood for a moment at the sink, hands resting on the counter. She felt grateful, not because everything was perfect, but because she could still make choices that mattered. There's a quiet empowerment in realizing that aging doesn't mean losing control. It means shifting from speed to care, from intensity to intention. That evening, as she settled into her chair with a book, she noticed how present she felt. Her mind wasn't foggy. Her mind wasn't foggy. Her body wasn't pulling her towards sleep too early. She read a few chapters without effort, enjoying the story instead of fighting fatigue. The engine was still running, smoothly, reliably. All it asked was to be treated like something worth preserving. The lid lifted, and the steam carried memories with it. Margaret leaned over the stove as she opened the pot, the warm fog brushing her face and glasses. The smell was simple: vegetables, herbs, something savory and familiar. Soup had a way of doing that, of reaching backward in time while staying firmly in the present. Sunday afternoons had become her quiet ritual. No rush, no audience, just chopping, stirring. The soup wasn't made from a recipe she followed closely. It never was. It changed depending on what she had, what looked good, what felt right. As she stirred, the spoon moving slowly through the pot, Margaret thought about how different this felt from the meals she used to prepare during her working years. Back then, cooking was squeezed between obligations. Dinner had to happen fast. Convenience mattered more than comfort. Now, time itself was an ingredient. She added a handful of greens and watched them wilt gently. There was no drama in it, just transformation through patience. Heat applied slowly, flavors meeting without force. Many people associate health with effort, strict plans, discipline, constant vigilance. But standing there, Margaret felt the opposite. This kind of cooking asked for presence, not control. Attention, not perfection. She tasted the broth and adjusted it slightly, then stepped back. The soup would be ready when it was ready. No need to rush. Later, she carried a bowl to the table and sat by the window. Outside, the afternoon light slanted across the yard, catching on fallen leaves. She took her first spoonful and felt the warmth settle, not just in her stomach, but in her chest. Soup didn't fill her up the way heavy meals did. It didn't weigh her down. It spread instead, like a blanket. She remembered her grandmother, who seemed to solve everything with soup. Cold weather, long days, tired bones. At the time, it felt old-fashioned. Now, it felt intuitive. What many people notice as they get older is that the body responds differently to textures as much as ingredients. Liquids, warmth, softness, they're easier to welcome. Less negotiating. Less work. Margaret ate slowly, listening to the quiet of the house. No television. No background noise. Just the steady rhythm of spoon to bowl. Afterward, she waited again, noticing the absence of heaviness, the way her breathing felt unforced, the way her shoulders stayed relaxed. There was something deeply reassuring about meals like this. They didn't promise anything. They didn't ask for belief. They simply supported the body in doing what it already knew how to do. As the evening approached, Margaret portioned the remaining soup into containers. Future meals, already decided, future evenings made easier. She thought about how often people search for answers in complexity, assuming that if something is effective, it must be complicated. But soup had endured across cultures and generations for a reason. It met the body where it was. Later, curled up with a blanket and a book, Margaret felt content, not energized in a restless way, just settled, nourished, at ease. There's a kind of wisdom in foods that don't try to impress. Foods that show up quietly, do their work, and leave you better than they found you. The pot on the stove had held more than a meal that day. It had held patience, memory, and care, things that matter just as much as what goes into the bowl. The fridge hummed softly, like it knew secrets it didn't need to share. Margaret stood in front of it, contemplating the contents. Not much had changed since yesterday. A carton of eggs, a few vegetables, some leftovers, neatly packed in glass containers. Nothing flashy, nothing tempting in a way that demanded attention, just the quiet promise of sustenance. She remembered a morning not long ago when she had stood here and felt indecisive, scanning for something exciting, something new, something that would wake her up from routine. Now, she felt calm. Presence replaced urgency. Patience replaced expectation. Breakfast that day was oatmeal plain, with a small spoonful of chopped apples and a sprinkle of cinnamon. She stirred slowly, listening to the soft crackle as the oats absorbed the milk. There was no rush, no competition with time, just nourishment unfolding. As she ate, her mind wandered to a comment she had overheard during a podcast interview. It was casual, almost tossed off, a reflection about keeping fuel simple, functional, and unassuming. No headlines, no promises, just a quiet approach that made sense over decades of work, travel, and decision-making. Margaret reflected on how much effort she had once put into meals, calculating calories, chasing trends, imagining outcomes. And yet, here she was, discovering a subtle truth. Sometimes, the best results come from the meals that demand the least drama. Many people notice that as the body ages, digestion slows, blood sugar reacts differently, and energy doesn't spike the way it once did. But Margaret didn't frame this as limitation. She framed it as awareness, like listening to a subtle rhythm that was always there but previously ignored. By mid-morning, she had prepped some vegetables for later: carrots, zucchini, and peppers. As she chopped, she thought about the way small preparations ripple forward. One simple act made her afternoons easier. The effort wasn't grandiose. It was cumulative, gentle, thoughtful. Later, she walked outside to collect the mail, the sun warm on her face. She noticed a neighbor's dog chasing its tail, the sound of distant lawnmowers, the smell of freshly cut grass. Small moments, ordinary, but they brought a quiet joy. She realized that food, routine, and attention to these tiny details were all connected. The body, the mind, the world, they moved more smoothly when handled with care. Dinner was similarly simple: roasted chicken breast, steamed green beans, and a small baked potato. She ate slowly, savoring textures and warmth, noticing how her body responded. No heaviness, no sudden fatigue, just balance. That evening, Margaret reflected in her notebook, writing a short line. Small, simple choices compound into ease. She smiled. The statement felt less like advice and more like a quiet truth she had discovered for herself. She turned off the kitchen light and sank into her chair. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, no flash of insight, just comfort, clarity, and the reassurance that living thoughtfully didn't require extremes. Sometimes, the smallest, most ordinary choices end up having the largest effect. They're quiet, unassuming, and quietly revolutionary. The kettle whistled before she even realized it. Margaret stirred the tea bag gently, listening to the faint hiss of steam rising. It was one of those afternoons where sunlight fell through the window at just the right angle, dust motes floating lazily in the warm glow. A small, ordinary moment, and yet it felt important. Somehow, it had weight without demanding attention. She thought back to breakfast, a simple bowl of yogurt with berries, nothing elaborate, nothing Instagram-worthy. And yet, as the morning unfolded, she felt light, steady, present. Her energy was quiet, unassuming, but it allowed her to move through the day with ease. Many people notice that as life gets busier, we chase novelty in food, complex recipes, exotic ingredients, extreme diets, but Margaret had discovered that the most sustaining meals were often the ones that required little thought but provided gentle nourishment. Later, she walked down to the community garden. The air was crisp, and the soil smelled rich and familiar. She knelt to check her raised beds, fingers brushing the dirt, feeling the small bumps of roots and rocks. Gardening had become a meditation of sorts. Each plant, each seedling required attention but rewarded patience. She thought of the body in the same way. Like the plants she tended, it needed care, consistency, and balance. Not perfection, not drama, just presence and gentle, thoughtful maintenance. At home, she prepared lunch, a bowl of lentil soup with a slice of whole grain bread. The lentils were soft and earthy, the bread warm and comforting. As she ate, Margaret noticed the calm that settled over her body. The heaviness that sometimes followed meals in the past was absent. Her digestion felt smooth, her mind clear. Later, she called her daughter, Emily, and shared the small discoveries of the day, the garden's progress, the warmth of tea, the way simple meals made her feel steady. Emily laughed softly. "It's funny," she said, "how the simplest things sometimes make the biggest difference." Margaret smiled. It felt true. Life didn't demand extremes. Its rewards were quiet, cumulative, subtle. The smallest acts, a meal chosen with care, a walk taken slowly, a plant nurtured, compounded into something meaningful over time. As the evening approached, Margaret reflected on how she had once equated best with extraordinary, impressive, or luxurious. Now, best meant ease, presence, and nourishment. It was steady, sustaining, and wholly personal. She washed her dishes, placed them in the drying rack, and stood by the window, watching the last sunlight fade. There was warmth in simplicity, and wisdom in noticing what genuinely supported her. The day ended not with a sense of achievement but with comfort and clarity, a reminder that the small, consistent choices carried more weight than any dramatic effort ever could. The morning light hit the countertop just right, glinting off the knife she used every day. Margaret lined up her ingredients for breakfast: a few eggs, some spinach, and a slice of whole grain toast. Nothing extraordinary, nothing flashy. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in this routine, in knowing exactly what she needed and why. The rhythm of her morning chopping, stirring, toasting felt grounding, a gentle anchor before the day began. She thought back over the past weeks, reflecting on the small changes she had made. Slower meals, simpler ingredients, lighter portions, and more awareness of how her body responded. Each choice had been minor on its own, yet collectively they had shifted something subtle but powerful: her energy, her clarity, her sense of control. Many people notice that over time, habits compound. The body and mind respond not to grand gestures but to steady, thoughtful attention. It's like tending a garden. The plants thrive not because of occasional extremes but because of consistent care. Water, sunlight, soil, patience. Margaret cracked the eggs into the pan, the sizzle a familiar soundtrack. She stirred in the spinach, watching it soften and brighten. As the aroma filled the kitchen, she felt a gentle pride, not in creating a masterpiece, but in honoring the quiet needs of her own body. Later, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table by the window. Outside, leaves rustled softly in the breeze, neighbors walking dogs, the occasional chirp of a bird. Ordinary life continued, unhurried. She noticed the sense of ease that had become a constant companion, the absence of heaviness that had once weighed on her afternoons and evenings. She reflected on her observations that sometimes the best meals are not about novelty or extreme health hacks. They're about alignment, food that moves smoothly through the body, fuels energy without taxing it, and fits naturally into daily life. The simplest actions often have the most profound effects. That afternoon, she took a slow walk through her neighborhood, noticing the little things: the warmth of the sun on her arms, the smell of freshly cut grass, the sound of children laughing in a nearby yard. The sense of presence that came from caring for her body now extended outward into the world around her. By evening, dinner was prepared and enjoyed without hurry: baked salmon, roasted vegetables, and a small portion of quinoa. She ate with mindfulness, savoring flavors and textures, and felt the familiar calm settle over her. The choices were consistent, the impact cumulative, the reward steady. Margaret cleaned up, noting that the most important meals weren't the ones that dazzled or promised miracles. They were the ones that supported her body and mind, quietly, every day. In that steadiness, she found empowerment, clarity, and joy. She closed her day with the thought scribbled in her notebook: small, mindful choices build a life of ease. It wasn't advice to anyone but herself, yet it carried the weight of lived experience. The kettle clicked off, leaving a quiet room behind. Margaret leaned against the counter, watching steam curl from the mug in her hands. It was just tea, nothing fancy, nothing new, but the warmth reminded her that small, intentional moments could anchor the day. She thought back to mornings like this over the past months, noticing the subtle shifts in her body: lighter digestion, steadier energy, a calmness that didn't rely on caffeine or distractions. Earlier that week, she had met her friend Linda for a short walk. They had wandered along the familiar neighborhood streets, talking about small frustrations, favorite recipes, and memories from decades past. At one point, Linda sighed and said, "I don't know why, but I feel better when my meals are simple. It's like everything else falls into place." Margaret had nodded, smiling. It wasn't miraculous, just steady, the quiet proof of patterns building over time. In the kitchen now, Margaret thought about the idea of fuel. Cars and engines came to mind again, a recurring metaphor that never felt forced. An older vehicle still runs, she mused, but it responds best to careful attention and appropriate maintenance. Overfeeding it or ignoring the basics causes strain. The body, she realized, was similar. It thrived not on extremes, but on balanced, consistent choices. Many people notice that digestion and energy shifts with age. Meals that once felt effortless may now demand attention, but awareness, Margaret had learned, could transform these subtle challenges into empowering practices rather than sources of anxiety. She sipped her tea and prepared lunch, a simple bowl of brown rice, lightly steamed broccoli, and a poached egg. Each bite reminded her how nourishment could be unassuming yet complete, how flavor didn't need to compete with heaviness. Her body felt lighter, more responsive. Her mind, calmer. Afterward, she spent time tending her indoor plants. Fingers brushed the soil, leaves stretched toward sunlight. She reflected on how care and attention didn't have to be grandiose to be effective. The smallest acts, stirring a pot, trimming a leaf, walking a few extra steps, compounded quietly over time. That evening, she shared a light dinner with her son Daniel. They talked about books, weather, and memories of past trips. The conversation flowed easily, not because of an elaborate setting or extravagant meal, but because the body and mind were aligned in ease and comfort. As Margaret cleaned the dishes, she felt gratitude for the clarity she'd gained. Meals had become tools of calm and nourishment rather than challenges or obligations. She realized that attention to these simple, consistent practices offered freedom. Freedom from heaviness, from sluggishness, from the constant noise of decision-making. Her journal waited beside her chair. She wrote one line, "Consistency is quiet power." It was a personal observation, modest but profound, blending life experience with gentle insight. The sunlight fell across the kitchen table like a quiet reminder. Margaret sipped her morning coffee and watched the steam rise, curling into the air before vanishing. It was a simple pleasure, unnoticed by many, but to her it carried a subtle reassurance. These small rituals, repeated day after day, had begun to shape the rhythm of her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Earlier, she had walked to the corner store to pick up a few essentials: eggs, spinach, a loaf of whole grain bread. The air was crisp, and the familiar route felt grounding. Passing neighbors, she waved, exchanging brief smiles. Ordinary interactions, ordinary moments, yet they reminded her of the gentle continuity of daily life, how simple routines could anchor a day. Back home, she prepared breakfast: scrambled eggs with sautéed mushrooms and a side of fresh fruit. The colors, the textures, the aroma, each detail mattered not for extravagance, but for nourishment and presence. She ate slowly, noticing how her body received the meal. There was no heaviness, no sudden fatigue, just a steady, comforting energy that allowed her to move through the morning with ease. Margaret thought about the way small choices compound over time. Many people notice that, as bodies age, attention to meals, sleep, and gentle activity matters more than ever. The difference isn't immediate or dramatic, but cumulative, a subtle shift that becomes noticeable only after weeks and months. After breakfast, she tended her small herb garden on the windowsill. Fingers brushed soil, leaves stretched toward the sun, and the scent of basil and thyme filled the kitchen. Caring for these tiny plants reminded her of the body. It thrived with consistent attention, patience, and gentle guidance. The same principle applied to meals, walks, and the rhythm of daily life. Later, she took a short walk around the neighborhood. Each step felt light and deliberate. Margaret noticed the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, the distant sound of children playing, the occasional bark of a dog. Awareness of these ordinary details made her feel present, engaged, and grateful. Dinner that evening was simple: roasted chicken with a side of steamed carrots and brown rice. She ate without distraction, noticing flavors and textures, the warmth of the food, the ease in her digestion. Her body responded with calm energy, reinforcing a lesson she had been learning quietly: the best meals were those that supported her without drama or fanfare. As the day drew to a close, Margaret reflected on the subtle power of small, consistent choices. Not flashy or impressive, they had transformed her experience of energy, clarity, and comfort. There was empowerment in noticing how ordinary actions, a mindful meal, a gentle walk, a moment of quiet, could ripple across her day and her well-being. She closed her notebook, jotting one line: quiet, thoughtful choices build a life that sustains itself. It was simple, honest, and deeply personal. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen as Margaret reached for a glass of water. It was mid-morning, and sunlight spilled across the countertop, highlighting the simple arrangement of bowls, utensils, and a small cutting board. She paused, noticing how ordinary the scene was, yet how comforting. These small, Repeated moments had begun to define her days, creating a rhythm that brought clarity and ease. Earlier that week, she had been at the library with her friend Linda, browsing cookbooks and nutrition guides. Most were full of fancy recipes and elaborate instructions. Margaret found herself drawn instead to the simple meals: soups, grain bowls, roasted vegetables. Minimal effort, maximum nourishment. Sometimes, she said to Linda, less really is more. Linda nodded, smiling knowingly. Back home, Margaret prepared a light lunch, a bowl of quinoa with steamed broccoli and a drizzle of olive oil. As she mixed the ingredients, she reflected on how her approach to meals had shifted. Years ago, she would have stressed about combinations, flavors, and trends. Now, the goal was balance and ease, food that supported her body without demanding attention or energy. Many people notice subtle changes in metabolism and energy as they age. Meals that once felt effortless may now weigh more heavily, and the body responds best to nourishment that is simple, mindful, and consistent. Margaret had learned to listen to those cues, adjusting portions, ingredients, and timing in ways that felt natural. After lunch, she took a short walk around her neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying faint scents of autumn leaves and distant baking. Margaret noticed the rhythm of her steps, the gentle sway of her arms, and the sense of calm that accompanied movement in the fresh air. These small routines, meals, walks, mindful moments were quietly transforming her energy and presence. Later, she returned to the kitchen to prepare dinner: baked salmon, roasted zucchini, and a small serving of sweet potato. She cooked with attention, not pressure, noticing textures and aromas, the warmth radiating from the oven, the softness of the vegetables as they cooked. Each step was meditative, reinforcing the connection between care, nourishment, and well-being. That evening, Margaret sat by the window with a cup of herbal tea, reflecting on how much her daily habits influenced her overall sense of ease. She realized that the cumulative effect of small, consistent choices, simpler meals, mindful preparation, gentle activity, had shifted her experience of energy, comfort, and clarity. She wrote one line in her notebook: "Consistency in small actions quietly builds a resilient life." It was a personal observation, a reminder of the quiet power inherent in mindful living. The morning sun caught the rim of her coffee mug, painting a golden line across the table. Margaret held it for a moment, savoring the warmth seeping into her hands, and inhaled the familiar aroma. It was ordinary, yes, but in its simplicity lay a steady reassurance. Over the past months, she had begun to notice how these small, repeated gestures shaped her days, grounding her, giving rhythm, and creating a quiet sense of control. Earlier that morning, she had taken a short walk around her block. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant pine. She noticed how her body responded: light steps, steady breath, no lingering fatigue. These walks had become a subtle practice, one that reinforced the calm she felt from the meals she prepared and the routines she maintained. Back in the kitchen, Margaret prepared breakfast: scrambled eggs with sautéed spinach and a slice of whole grain toast. She didn't rush. She noticed the way the eggs fluffed in the pan, the spinach wilted gently, and the bread toasted evenly. Each detail, ordinary in itself, contributed to a larger sense of presence and nourishment. Many people notice that as metabolism slows and energy fluctuates, the timing and composition of meals can significantly affect how the body feels. Margaret found that choosing foods that were light yet sustaining allowed her to move through her day with steady energy and clarity. The difference wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative, subtle, and profoundly reassuring. After breakfast, she spent a few minutes tending her indoor herb garden. Basil leaves stretched toward the light, tiny new shoots emerging from the soil. She watered gently, watching the droplets glisten. It reminded her of the body. Small, consistent care created lasting results. Over time, attention and presence became more powerful than any singular effort or quick fix. Later, she prepared lunch: a simple bowl of lentils with roasted carrots and a drizzle of olive oil. The flavors were humble but satisfying, the textures familiar and comforting. As she ate, Margaret reflected on how ordinary choices, predictable meals, mindful preparation, small movements could quietly transform the way she felt throughout the day. That evening, dinner followed the same philosophy: roasted chicken with green beans and a small baked potato. Nothing elaborate, nothing forced, just nourishment that supported her body and mind. She ate slowly, appreciating flavors, textures, and the sense of ease that accompanied her choices. Before bed, she journaled. Small, consistent actions ripple outward in ways we rarely notice. It was an observation she had lived, rather than theorized. Each gentle adjustment in meals, movement, and attention compounded into a sense of calm, energy, and presence that defined her days. The sunlight slipped through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the countertop. Margaret stood by the sink, rinsing a fresh bunch of spinach, feeling the cool water run over her fingers. It was a small act, ordinary and mundane, yet somehow grounding. Over the months, she had learned to find meaning in these little routines, appreciating the rhythm and simplicity they brought to her day. Earlier, she had met her neighbor, Tom, for a brief chat while collecting the mail. He commented on the crispness of the morning air and the way the leaves had begun to turn. Margaret noticed how their conversation flowed easily, light, unhurried, familiar. These small interactions reminded her that the pace of life need not be frantic to be fulfilling. Back in her kitchen, she prepared breakfast, a soft-boiled egg with avocado on a slice of whole-grain toast. She arranged the plate carefully, noticing colors, textures, and aromas. Eating slowly, she felt a gentle warmth spread through her body. No heaviness, no abrupt energy spikes, just steady nourishment. Many people notice that as the body ages, it responds more sensitively to what it consumes. Margaret had discovered that simple meals, thoughtfully prepared, supported her energy without overwhelming her system. It was less about restriction and more about alignment, eating in ways that complemented the body's natural rhythm. Later, she spent time tending her small garden. Tiny seedlings poked through the soil, resilient and bright. She watered them with care, feeling a quiet connection to growth, patience, and attention. The garden, like her meals and daily habits, rewarded consistency rather than grand gestures. Lunch was modest, a bowl of brown rice with lightly steamed vegetables and a drizzle of olive oil. Margaret savored the textures, the gentle warmth, and the sense of balance it offered. Each bite reinforced a subtle truth she had come to appreciate, that care and mindfulness in small, ordinary actions could ripple outward, influencing her entire day. Evening arrived with a sense of calm. Dinner was simple yet satisfying, baked salmon with roasted zucchini and a small side of quinoa. As she ate, she reflected on how ordinary routines, consistent meals, gentle walks, mindful moments, had quietly shifted her experience of energy, comfort, and clarity. Margaret closed her journal with a soft sigh, jotting one line: "Nourishment is not a single act but a series of gentle, consistent choices." It was a personal reflection, quiet and unassuming, yet carrying the weight of lived experience. The afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window, throwing a warm glow over the chopping board. Margaret leaned over, slicing carrots into even sticks, listening to the soft crunch each one made against the wood. It was a sound she had come to associate with care, with attentiveness, with moments that mattered more than she had realized. These ordinary acts, preparing food, arranging it neatly on a plate, observing colors and textures, had become anchors in her daily life, reminders that small gestures could carry profound significance. She thought back to her morning walk, where she had wandered along familiar streets, greeting neighbors and noticing the subtle shift of seasons in the trees. The air was crisp but not biting, carrying hints of pine and earth. Margaret had walked slowly, deliberately, feeling the muscles in her legs stretch and engage. Each step had been quiet, measured, yet somehow energizing. It reminded her that movement need not be strenuous to be meaningful. It could simply be deliberate, mindful, and attuned to the body's needs. After returning home, she made herself a light lunch, a bowl of lentils with steamed broccoli and a drizzle of olive oil. As she stirred the ingredients, she reflected on the simple truths she had discovered over the years. The most effective meals were often those that demanded the least drama. They nourished without overwhelming, supported without demanding attention, and created a quiet steadiness that carried her through the day. Many studies note that as people age, the body responds differently to nutrients, digestion slows, and energy fluctuates in subtle ways. Margaret didn't focus on statistics or scientific jargon. Instead, she observed how her own body responded. When she chose foods that were simple, wholesome, and balanced, her afternoons felt lighter, her mind clearer, her energy steadier. It wasn't about restriction or perfection, it was about harmony, listening, and responding. Later, she tended to her indoor plants. Tiny basil shoots stretched toward the sunlight, their green vibrant against the terracotta pots. She watered them slowly, feeling the soft resistance of soil through her fingers. There was a lesson here. Care applied consistently, even in small doses, yielded growth and vitality. The same principle applied to her meals, her walks, her moments of mindfulness. It was not grand gestures, but small, deliberate acts that shaped her well-being. Margaret remembered a conversation she had had with her daughter, Emily, earlier that week. Emily had been rushing through her day, stressed and distracted. "Mom," she said, "I don't have time for all this. I feel like I'm falling behind." Margaret smiled gently and replied, "Sometimes the smallest, quietest choices, a meal made thoughtfully, a few minutes outside, a pause to breathe, are the ones that shift everything." Emily had nodded slowly, as if beginning to understand the subtle power of routine, patience, and attention. By late afternoon, Margaret prepared dinner: baked salmon, roasted zucchini, and a small serving of quinoa. She worked deliberately, savoring the process of cooking, noticing aromas, textures, and the warmth rising from the oven. Each step reinforced what she had been learning: that attention, presence, and care, even in mundane acts, compounded into meaningful change over time. Sitting down to eat, Margaret felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The food nourished her body without weighing it down. Her mind felt clear, her energy steady. She reflected on how far she had come, from rushing through meals and life to embracing simplicity, consistency, and mindfulness. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a gradual, cumulative shift, almost imperceptible, until she paused to notice. Later, she curled up in her favorite chair, notebook in hand. She wrote slowly, "Nourishment is not about extremes or miracles. It is about presence, patience, and gentle consistency." These words felt personal, earned, and quiet, a testament to the subtle power of small, intentional acts. As the evening light faded, Margaret looked out the window at the quiet street. Leaves danced softly in the breeze, neighbors closed shutters, and the world continued its steady rhythm. She felt aligned with it, moving at a pace that honored her body, her mind, and her days. The kitchen smelled faintly of rosemary and toasted bread, a subtle warmth that filled the room without demanding attention. Margaret stood at the counter, chopping a handful of fresh vegetables for dinner. The rhythm of the knife against the cutting board was almost meditative, a small, ordinary action that grounded her in the present. She paused occasionally to inhale the aromas, the earthy sweetness of carrots, the bright green tang of bell peppers, and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. There was something comforting about preparation, about taking time to care for herself through these simple acts. Earlier that morning, she had gone for a slow walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the subtle scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. Children's laughter drifted faintly from a nearby yard, mixing with the distant hum of traffic. Margaret noticed her own body's response. Light steps, steady breath, a calm energy that had become familiar over the past months. Walking had become more than just movement. It was a way to honor her body's needs and connect with the rhythm of life around her. Back home, she prepared a mid-morning snack, a small bowl of Greek yogurt with fresh berries. She stirred gently, appreciating the colors and textures, the smooth creaminess balanced by the tart sweetness of the fruit. Margaret had come to see meals not as tasks or obligations, but as invitations. Invitations to notice, to care, and to respond to what her body needed. Many people notice that as metabolism and digestion shift with age, the way we fuel ourselves becomes even more influential. For her, simplicity and mindfulness had replaced complicated rules and rigid plans. Later, she tended her herb garden. Tiny shoots of basil and parsley stretched toward the sunlight, resilient despite the cooler weather. She watered them slowly, feeling the gentle resistance of soil under her fingers. The process reminded her of her own body. Patience, consistency, and gentle care yielded lasting results. Growth didn't require extremes, just attentiveness and nurture over time. Lunch was modest yet satisfying. A bowl of quinoa with steamed broccoli and a drizzle of olive oil. As she ate, Margaret reflected on the subtle power of repeated small choices. No single meal would define her health or energy, but consistent, thoughtful decisions compounded over days, weeks, and months. The simplicity of her meals supported a steadiness in energy and mood that she had once believed required complex interventions. In the afternoon, she met a friend for tea. They talked about books, small neighborhood happenings, and memories from years past. Margaret noticed how her energy remained even, her mind clear, her body light. These ordinary interactions, paired with the simple nourishment she had chosen throughout the day, created a quiet confidence, a sense that life's pace could be measured, manageable, and deeply satisfying. By early evening, Margaret prepared dinner: baked salmon with roasted zucchini, and a small portion of sweet potato. She cooked slowly, noticing each texture and aroma, appreciating the warmth rising from the oven. Eating was not rushed. Each bite reminded her of the subtle shifts she had cultivated over time. Digestion felt easier, energy more stable, focus sharper, and her sense of calm deeper. She thought of all the small, deliberate choices that had led to this moment. None were dramatic, none were revolutionary, yet cumulatively they had reshaped her experience of daily life. After dinner, she cleaned the kitchen and sat with a cup of herbal tea. Outside, the sky had deepened into early twilight, the neighborhood quiet and calm. Margaret reflected on the wisdom she had accumulated. Nourishment was not about extremes or quick fixes. It was about mindfulness, attention, and gentle, consistent care. Each simple meal, each short walk, each small act of presence had built a foundation for resilience, energy, and clarity. She opened her notebook and wrote slowly. Health and vitality grow quietly, nurtured by consistency, patience, and attention to the ordinary. These words weren't advice for anyone else, they were her own reflection, a personal truth she had observed and lived. As she leaned back in her chair, Margaret felt a profound sense of ease. The cumulative effect of countless small choices had shifted her days, her energy, and her perspective. She smiled softly, aware that this quiet empowerment was available to anyone willing to notice, respond, and care for themselves gently, steadily, and thoughtfully. The living room was quiet, the late afternoon sun filtering through sheer curtains, casting a warm, dappled glow across the worn carpet. Margaret sat at the edge of her armchair, a mug of chamomile tea resting between her hands, and let herself simply breathe. The rhythm of her days, the steady cadence she had cultivated over months, settled around her like a gentle embrace. She had grown accustomed to noticing small things: the way sunlight highlighted dust motes in the air, the subtle changes in flavor and texture in her meals, the gentle hum of life unfolding outside her window. Earlier that morning, she had walked slowly through the neighborhood, appreciating the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the faint aroma of fresh-cut grass drifting from a nearby yard. Children's laughter and the distant bark of a dog filled the air in soft, comforting bursts. Margaret noticed her own body responding. Movements were lighter, breath steadier, energy sustained in a way it hadn't been before. These walks, once optional and occasional, had become a cornerstone of her days, a deliberate, mindful acknowledgement that movement and presence were intertwined. Breakfast had been simple but satisfying: oatmeal topped with blueberries and a sprinkle of cinnamon. As she stirred, she reflected on how her approach to meals had shifted. In the past, she had chased trends and complicated recipes, hoping for immediate results. Now, she understood that nourishment was a quiet, steady practice, an accumulation of small, thoughtful choices that supported both body and mind. Many people notice that over time, digestion slows and energy fluctuates. Margaret had found that meals which were balanced, simple, and prepared with care created a sense of calm and stability that carried her through each day. She tended her herb garden next, watering the basil and thyme with measured, patient movements. Tiny green shoots reached for the sunlight, resilient and persistent. The act reminded her of her own life. Growth and vitality weren't produced by extremes or sudden changes, but by consistent attention, patience, and gentle care. Just as the plants thrived with small, regular acts of nurture, her body and mind had responded to mindful, steady habits over time. Lunch was modest: a bowl of quinoa with roasted carrots, zucchini, and a drizzle of olive oil. Margaret ate slowly, savoring each bite and noticing the way her body received the nourishment. There was no heaviness, no abrupt energy spike, only steadiness and calm. She reflected on how ordinary acts, repeated daily, had accumulated into profound shifts in her energy, focus, and overall well-being. It was remarkable how subtle choices, consistently applied, could ripple outward to transform entire days. The afternoon passed gently. Margaret wrote a few lines in her journal, capturing observations, memories, and reflections. She noted the warmth of sunlight on her arms, the gentle creak of her chair, the quiet satisfaction of completing small tasks with care. These moments, seemingly insignificant to an outsider, had become deeply meaningful to her. Each one was a reminder that life's richness often resided in the ordinary, in the deliberate attention we give to small, thoughtful actions. Dinner was prepared with the same calm intention: baked salmon, lightly roasted vegetables, and a small portion of brown rice. As she cooked, Margaret noticed the subtle aromas, the warmth of the oven, and the textures of the ingredients. Eating became an act of mindfulness, a way to honor her body and the care she had taken to nourish it throughout the day. There was joy in simplicity and satisfaction in routine that was chosen consciously rather than imposed. Later, as she sat in her chair with a final sip of tea, Margaret reflected on the journey she had been on over the past months. What had begun as curiosity about small changes in diet, movement, and attention had blossomed into a holistic approach to life. She had learned that true vitality did not come from extreme measures or dramatic interventions, but from gentle, consistent care, the kind that allowed her body and mind to function optimally and harmoniously over time. She opened her notebook and wrote one final line for the day. Well-being is built quietly, patiently, and intentionally, one mindful choice at a time. The words resonated deeply, a testament to the subtle power of ordinary acts compounded over time. Margaret felt a profound sense of accomplishment and calm, knowing that she had cultivated habits and awareness that would carry her forward with ease and energy. Outside, the neighborhood grew quiet as evening approached, leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, listening, breathing, feeling her body at ease. She understood now that the journey of health and vitality was not a pursuit of extremes or perfection, but a steady, mindful practice, an accumulation of small, deliberate choices that shifted everything. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything?